briefly to introduce myself, Frank Rees. I'm the chair of the academic board at the university, sometime principal of Whitley College, a Baptist minister by training and background. I'm delighted to welcome you all. And as we gather, we acknowledge the traditional custodians on the lands on which we stand. We pay our respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and acknowledge any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be with us today. The University of Divinity is committed to working and praying for reconciliation and justice. This conversation today focuses on ministry in a time of COVID, and I'm hoping that together we can share some insights relating to this. Reflections on experiences, situations, and theological learning, discovery, reflection in this process. I'm actually not going to one by one introduce the panel members, but have asked them to do that as they right now begin to respond to our first question, which is simply to ask them about their ministry context and how has COVID-19 affected that ministry situation and those people with whom they are working. Could I call upon you, Colleen, to begin?
Oh yes, thank you, Frank, and hello everyone. I'm Colleen O'Reilly and I'm an Anglican priest. I'm the chaplain to Trinity College in Parkville in Melbourne. But before I went to Trinity College in the middle of last year, I'd been a parish priest for over 20 years. So my context of ministry is the college chapel and the college, although I don't have a great deal to do with the residential students. And as you can imagine, in first semester, the college went into severe lockdown, and all the staff who were not actually residents not allowed on site, and that's still the case. And this semester, the college is open to residential students, but only half of them are there because of the distancing requirements. And so my ministry at the college is about supporting people, and but mostly it's to do with chapel services, which are not being held at the moment. So the very first thing we had to do, or I had to do, was get in touch with the couples whose weddings were booked to tell them you won't be getting married in the chapel. And for the most part, people cancelled those weddings anyway, or deferred them rather, delayed them until next year sometime. The most public ministry I've exercised since March was funerals. I've done 3 funerals in lockdown conditions with only 10 present, and not in the chapel, but at other venues. And so it's meant taking funerals again in a crematorium, which is something I didn't very often do in the past. If people wanted funerals involving my ministry, they wanted a church, they wanted to be in church. So that's what I was more accustomed to, but that in itself is not a problem. And I haven't had any kind of existential anxiety or crisis, because I'm used to living where I work. So working from home is nothing new. I'm used to living on site in a parish, and although I don't live at Trinity, I find there's nothing unusual about working from my study at home. And I have no anxiety about who I am in ministry, because our ordinal is very clear that we, when we're ordained, we are to live and work as a priest. So we are who we are before we do anything we do. And anyway, I see the primary task of a priest is to pray for the people in their care. So that's step 1, is very readily achieved. And I say morning prayer with the faculty of Trinity College Theological School each morning, which is very supportive for me. So that's how things have been for me at the moment.
Thank you so much, Colleen, for kicking us off. Your ministry situation is different from that of a number of others who are in congregational ministry, and I'm going to call on each of those, if you will, to share in regard to this same thing. How has the COVID situation affected your context of ministry and your own experience thereof? Father Tony Doran.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name's Tony Doran. I'm a Catholic priest. I've been a priest for 17 years and all of that has been in parish ministry. I'm currently the parish priest of Ringwood. In some ways, I'd share many of the same understandings of priesthood and me that Colleen just expressed, that I'm a priest before I do anything else. But I actually found the first period of lockdown really disconcerting and, disorienting in some ways. One of the main things I do every day is celebrate morning mass for the 20 or 25, 30 people who come to the parish. To be without that context and without that contact, I found really challenging. And when we first went into lockdown, it was long before we'd learned how to live stream and do any of those sort of flash things. So the Archbishop encouraged us to keep saying Mass privately for the people. Happy to do that, but saying Mass in the house with no one else there, God might have been happy with it, but I'm not sure that I was particularly happy with it because it was without context for me.
Mm-hmm.
And while I would say that I would, share Colleen's understanding of priesthood and me, perhaps I'm not as far down that, track as I thought I might have once been.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Thank you for that. Carolyn Francis.
Thanks, Frank. Hi, everyone. I'm Carolyn Francis. I'm one of the ministers at Collins Street Baptist Church in Melbourne, in the centre of the city. Obviously, as with all of you, we ceased gathering many months ago now, and for a church that has had such a public face within the city, that's been disorienting, I think, for lots of us, not just because of the loss of our own practices of gathering and worship, but perhaps most of all because of the loss of the context, which was that bustling, busy city where the people were so present to us and their concerns, whether those be being overworked or underworked or being very wealthy or very poor, all of those human experiences which gave context to our gathering and our expression of faith were removed from us. So it's been an interesting and challenging time to learn how to practice our gathered faith via video and other means, but also to think about what it means to engage with this broader community in which we have a home at a time when the city has become a bit of a ghost town, and we're still learning.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And Craig D'Alton.
Thanks, Frank. Craig Dalton at Christchurch, South Yarra. I'm the vicar here. I've been here for about a year and a half, as I've commented to a number of people. Thank goodness I started at the beginning of last year rather than at the beginning of this year. I thoroughly feel for those colleagues who've actually begun new ministries this year, and in some cases actually have begun new ministries in the midst of this.
Yes.
I can't imagine how that could work. I've tried to think a little bit about this question as the others have been speaking, and I mean in terms of the parish itself, Christchurch is a very liturgically driven parish, and what I call a big spectacle liturgy parish, and music is a very big part of what we do. And so for the parish, I think the hardest thing has been the loss of the big event. The weekly big event, but also the other big events that punctuate the year. And that's been, I think, one of the hardest things for the parish community here, because it's challenged their own self-understanding of what is Christchurch about. And some people have embraced, the online environment quite happily, and I think those, in some cases at least, are the sorts of people who are actually looking for intimate community, which bizarrely a medium like this can provide. But for many others, particularly the ones who are, as it were, more marginal to our general community and who come along for worship but don't necessarily engage much beyond that and don't wish to. Those sorts of people, it's been really quite hard to maintain an active and meaningful contact with. Having said that, one of the things that's been most interesting is that, once again, the move to an online environment has enabled some people who were marginal, perhaps, but who are comfortable enough with the online thing, to become more involved. And one of the things that we've just started doing in this second hard lockdown is we've moved the daily office onto Zoom. And the daily office at Christchurch historically basically has been the ministry team and pretty much nobody else. And now I'm getting 13, 14 people at morning prayer every day, which is extraordinary. And a bit more like what I'm used to from my previous placement. But that's been a real shift. And those people are not necessarily the usual suspects. In some cases, they're people whose faces I've had to look at and find their name on the parish roll to try and work out who they are. So that's been a really interesting one. In terms of the way it's impacted on me, I think probably the thing I found hardest, and I'm echoing a little bit perhaps some of what Tony was saying, is celebrating the Eucharist not on my own, because Anglicans aren't allowed to do that, but being the only one to receive. That is something I kind of got used to now, but my goodness me, it was hard to get used to it when it started. It was a very strange experience, and it's still a very strange experience, you know, talking to camera rather than talking to people. If there are people there, usually they're at the side rather than in front of me, and that feels very strange. The only other thing I'd say is that we've kind of got a parish policy here for COVID time, which is that we're doing no more and no less than we are allowed to do. So whatever the rules say is possible, we are trying to do, and if it's not allowed, we don't do it.
Well, thank you very much for those insights. Fran, Barber, your ministry context is a little different. Just before I ask you to speak, I omitted to mention at the beginning that our colleague and friend, Reverend Dr. Ji Zhang, sadly, his mother passed away just yesterday. He may be able to join us for a little while. I will be very grateful if he is able to do that, but I'm sure that we all understand that that's very likely not to be the case, and our prayers and love are with him. Fran Barber.
Thank you, Frank. So, hello everyone. I'm Fran Barber, and my role at the moment is Coordinator of Continuing Education for ministers in Victoria and Tasmania in the Uniting Church. So I'm a Uniting Church minister. And it is a slightly different ministry than I've been involved in before. So in terms of this period, I am now working from home, whereas this role normally works in a fairly busy office environment. So that's had personal challenges to it, especially as I have 3 children who are home learning, have been since March. The role itself is an interesting one. I see the parish, the ministers out there as my parish, as it were. And the urgency of the situation now means really continuing education is not really top of their list. Well, I'd like it to be top of the list at the best of times, but really now it's not. And so it's been, the challenge for me has been how to engage meaningfully and helpfully with ministers, which sometimes means stepping back. Part of my role is particularly overseeing continuing education for brand new ministers, and there are a couple in my care who have had their ordinations postponed. And my energy has been greater with that group this year for obvious reasons, and I'm mentoring a couple of those more intensely than would normally be the case. And like some of the other reflections, doing things on Zoom, doing things differently has meant when I can put on major events, and they're fewer, they're the things that fall off the list, but more people are coming. So there's a greater diversity who can turn up. I'll just leave it there, I think.
Well, thank you very much. That's extremely helpful to us all to have the sense of what what the impact is upon the things that we might expect to do, and some of what that means for us ourselves. Now that leads me to ask a question that's perhaps already begun to be answered, but in what ways this particular experience is challenging our understanding of what it means to be the church. And that has to do with the dynamics of ministry. But let's move into that thing where, in this context, where the congregation cannot gather, where the things that make up the life of the church in our regular day-by-day or week-by-week thing have been set aside. So we're not able to gather for worship, and in many aspects of it, also not able to visit with people, to engage in face-to-face pastoral care in many contexts. What does it mean to be the church? I wonder, Craig, would you like to kick off with that one?
Thanks, Frank. As I mentioned before, the impact here at one level has been about style of church. When it comes to actually, being church, the church is, of course, the people. Though it's interesting working out the extent to which the building really matters. In fact, one of the reflections I gave quite early on in this was about the challenges this poses to our sense of holy place and holy space. And I talked, about Christians who get too hung up on saying the buildings don't matter and all the rest of it. And I pointed out to them all, talk to any Indigenous person about whether place and space matters. And I think actually the same applies for all of us in one way or another, and for Christians, our church buildings do matter. So the disconnect of the community from the place, I think, has been one of the most challenging things. But I think actually the biggest challenge is evangelism. How do you make new Christians in this environment? If I can, put it in that language. How do you? It's been really encouraging to see the way that people have embraced the opportunities that we've tried to create for them to grow in their own faith, and things like our online Bible study groups and so on have been really well attended, which is great. But actually encountering new people is very hard, because they don't have something they can just come along. They can't. A lot of the growth end in a parish like Christchurch comes from what I call the back pew ministry, people who are kind of sniffing around and they've just got enough whatever to get into the building, and they sit in the back pew, and it's all about them gradually moving up. Mm-hmm. It's really hard to do that in an online environment. I think probably the exception for that for us has been, we've done twice weekly Facebook Live sort of 10-minute reflection thing, and that seems to be getting around a lot of people who are not Christchurch people. But I suspect it's probably preaching to the converted in other contexts rather than actually making new Christians. So I think that's one of the real challenges for the church. We become insular. We become focused just on our own selves and keeping the show on the road, keeping it all going, rather than actually doing the evangelistic and missional aspects of our ministry. I think they're the ones that are easiest to drop off.
Mm-hmm. Father Tony, I'm wondering if you'd like to come in on that question. Are there insights or challenges to our understanding of what it means to be the church through this experience?
I think there are, picking up something that Craig said about the importance of place. I wasn't too fussed about live streaming Sunday services or weekday services early on. I learned how to do it, and we did a little bit of it until a parishioner came to me and said, oh, Father, we know we can watch the Archbishop from the cathedral, but we don't want to see him. We want to see our church with our priest. So that connection to the local building, because it's their building and I'm their priest. And that's really been important. And so we've persevered with live streaming, and And we've found with live streaming that a lot more people than just our parishioners are watching masses. We've got parents of parishioners who are watching masses because their parishes aren't doing anything. We're getting contacted via our Facebook page because people are seeing us celebrate Mass and are making connections that way. So that's been an interesting thing, because we basically had no social media presence before this. We've ramped it up considerably since then, and that's reaching all sorts of new and different people. We've learned how to do baptism preparation online via Zoom. That works reasonably well. But yeah, we are reaching out, or our presence is filtering out to a whole lot of other people that
Yes.
that we haven't sort of tried to necessarily reach, but that's good all the same. But it's certainly that as much as we talk about church being universal and all of that, one of the insights from this community that I've got is that it might be all of that, but it's certainly very local.
Thank you for that. But there is something in there that I'd like to press a little bit further, if I may. I was tempted to ask whether you told the Archbishop that the people didn't want to see him or not. But
Not yet.
You haven't yet. What I was thinking about was you used the expression that people perhaps from other parishes were watching. And I'm wondering whether we could explore the challenge of watching an event, a worship event, and what that means, because largely we would be hoping for something more than spectator, isn't it? Can you help me unpack that a bit, Tony?
Yeah. While technology is wonderful and it allows us to actually reach people with worship this way, we do end up in that conundrum that people are at home watching, and there's not full active and conscious participation in the church. As a liturgist, I hate that, the action being separated from the community. But I haven't got an answer as to what else we do in this situation. Some places are doing nothing, and I don't think that's an option really, just to do nothing. So it's the best of a bad lot, I suspect, for me anyway. And I early on, because at the moment we've got nobody coming into church under stage 4. I could have 4 people coming to help me, but the rules around that are a bit too much. So I've just opted to go back to me doing everything. But I don't make the responses to myself, because that just seems dumb. To say the Lord be with you and with your spirit. But it's a skill to leave space for people to be able to make the responses at home.
Thank you. Carolyn, what would be your perspective on what we've just been discussing?
Well, others have spoken very eloquently, I think, about the challenges, the strengths and weaknesses of the digital worship experience. I think one of the things I've been grappling with is the broader experience of being the church while scattered, beyond the worship event, if you like. I've long said, and it's probably something you drummed into me, Frank, during my theological education, that we are, of course, the church whilst scattered as well as whilst gathered. But I've been incredibly heartened at the way in which many people have been able to embrace this sense of their own vocation, I guess, that as they are in their own context, in their neighbourhood, in their virtual workplace, in their children's school environment, that they somehow are still the church. And by that I mean somehow the expression of the risen life of Christ. And that there is an increased sense amongst many people, I think, of the importance of that calling for them personally, that there is something that they are able to share of the life and the liveliness of Christ in their own context. And I don't necessarily mean evangelism via words or preaching, but via their work toward the common good, their neighbourliness, and their ability to practice much of which we have seen as the vocation of the church, but to practice that wherever they happen to be right now.
Being the church.
Being the church, and it doesn't replace much of what we feel we have currently lost. But it is something that I hope continues long after this crisis, that there is a real sense of people expressing their faith through their life where they are planted.
Thank you. That leads us perhaps to another of the things that we thought we may talk about, which is simply, are we actually learning more about our faith through this experience? And you were hinting at something of that, Carolyn. I'm wondering, Colleen, whether that's something you are sensing with the people you are working with.
Yes, I think, well, it's lovely to have more time to read and reflect, which is a bit of a bonus. But I'm also very conscious that we've learnt that the dynamic between gathering and dispersing is actually essential. That we're not called to be, it's not either or, we're called to be a people who gather and who are then sent out. And I think we've recovered, I certainly have a new sense of how key that is to who we are and what we do as church. And I don't think we would ever be satisfied if Zoom replaced actually gathering together at the table and around the word. So that's one thing I think I've learned. And I've also learned, I've been talking quite a lot to parish clergy because I did a little bit of a survey a few weeks ago about what people were doing to overcome the gap. And it's just plain hard. It's just really hard work. I mean, I'm in a privileged position. I'm no longer trying to keep a parish connected to one another. But I think the task of parish clergy at the moment, trying to hold the people together and invite them into worship in a way that is meaningful, as Tony's trying to do, so you don't answer your own invitations in worship. That's just plain hard work. And I think in our diocese, we're going to discover that lots of communities are much more fragile in terms of staying viable parishes than we ever realised. So I think it's going to shake us up in all sorts of ways, that some of which will be very challenging. But I do hope that there's a kind of a new slowness might come out of this too, a new ability just to be with ourselves and be with issues, and not want to be rushing into trying to find that silver bullet that's going to get us out of whatever we think we're in.
Yes, thank you for that. I really value your observation of the essential dynamic of gathering and dispersing. And I think one of the things that has for me been a significant dynamic in ministry is to ask what is gathered, not only who gathers, but that dispersing, we go to be the church, and when we gather, we bring those experiences with us. And I think Colleen and Carolyn have both touched on the fact that we've been learning stuff while we haven't been able to gather. And when we are able to gather again, let's hope that those insights are not lost. This is, I think, part of the purpose of what we are doing here now, is theologically to reflect on this experience and what is it's actually giving to us about the nature of our life as a community of faith and the nature of that living of the faith. Fran, are there things there that the people, including those newly formed in ministry, insights there?
I think when I engage with ministers now, I'm aware that it's almost asking too much to find out what they're learning at the moment. I mean, this is going to take some time to settle back. I think in the Uniting Church anyway, we have choice about, for example, whether communion is celebrated and in what way in classic Uniting Church style. I think those places, for example, who are choosing to wait and are thinking about what it is to be the body of Christ. Are we starving ourselves? No, we're not. How are we not? How are we gathering meaningfully? All of those questions are being asked in some pockets, and it is leading to deeper discipleship.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think I've got anything else. Oh, the only other thing I'd say, and this sounds a bit random and disparate, but this is from my encounter with ministers, is that, and many on here will concur with this, is that those aspects of ministry which gives a minister the most energy, and certainly that's true for me now, what has been utterly compromised or lost. And that's the small group engagements. It's face-to-face supervision, it's professional development face-to-face, it's, and so it's about, as Colleen said, it's hard yakka. And I've been on a couple of ministry meets like this one in a couple of presbyteries. And when their parishioners are not there, they are exhausted. The odd semi-retired ones are pretty good with no kids. They're pretty okay. Most of them are drained.
I'm wondering what people around here are thinking about that.
I was just making an admission.
I think you've put your finger on something very, very important there, and a component in all of that is precisely that whether we label ourselves as introverts or extroverts, we actually do need the physical presence of each other to sustain our lives and our ministry. And it is very difficult when that is not possible. One of the things that our colleague and friend Ji Zhang said to me when we were talking about this conversation was that this kind of experience is something that the church in China knows about very deeply. They had decades when they could not legally gather and had to work through precisely these kinds of questions, and their insights into what it means to sustain ministry and to be the church in this kind of experience are very valuable to us at this time. Carly, I'm wondering if we might now turn to whether there are some questions from our community here that we might wrestle with.
Yes, so if you would like to pose a question to the panel, if you can please you can either write your question in the chat or you can just write the word question to join the queue in the chat. So I invite you all now, at the bottom of your Zoom screen, there's a button which says chat. You can click on that and type into the group chat and I'll come to you as the questions arise. I'll just give you a moment to get organised with that and we can pose your questions.
Well, while that's happening, there are a number of things we can summarise from the things that we've shared. Some really powerful statements, beginning with the recognition that in ministry, it is who we are before what we do, that the people are essential to the life of the church. Learning about the importance of the dynamic of dispersing and gathering, and therefore also the fundamental importance of place. We've been speaking also about the significance of the sacraments and the liturgy. I'm not sure that anyone has actually been able to speak about baptizing, though some are preparing people for baptizing, but the water may have to wait, right? Mightn't it? Now we do have at least...
Yep. Question from Sandra. Sandra, if you'd like to unmute yourself, you can pose that question to the panel. And panelists, I invite you just to unmute yourselves and answer as you wish during this time.
I was just wondering if anyone on the panel has noticed that there's new and exciting opportunities for the church, and if so, what are they?
I'm happy to have a little go. I think there have probably been more challenges than opportunities. I'm a big fan of turning challenges into opportunities. So, for example, at the moment, Christchurch is a building site. We're doing some work on the interior of the building that would have been incredibly disruptive to have done during normal times, but at a time when the building is closed for worship, actually, apart from a couple of funerals that we've had to move elsewhere, it hasn't been disruptive at all in terms of our day-to-day. So that's a kind of side benefit. One opportunity, I'm not sure it's quite the right word, but one sort of positive development I alluded to before around saying in the morning office via Zoom, which is absolutely something, we talked to the ministry team, that's absolutely going to carry on beyond this, because one of the things I've been trying to do ever since I arrived here was to encourage lay people to get involved in daily prayer rather than just making it a Sunday morning thing. And an outcome of this has been reasonably substantial. It's probably about more than 20 involved. A reasonably substantial number of lay people actually involved in weekday daily prayer. So that's been a really exciting thing from my point of view, because I find that very sustaining and feeding to go to something that Fran said earlier.
Were there others who...
Frank, I'll pitch in. I don't know that there are too many Baptists here, so I feel like I can say things with a level of freedom.
I'll just write them down.
Yeah, what's said here stays here. So my experience in nearly 20 years of ministry is that to change anything significant or to try anything new usually involves a robust and extensive period of discussion and thinking, and everyone has a view, and all of the things that could go wrong are expressed. Whereas right now, you know, we had to pivot in a matter of days to some kind of online expression of church. We could try anything. I mean, we can give anything a go, and there is a permission to try and fail, and there is a permission to try things that would have been dissected to within an inch of their life in normal time. Now, some of those things will fail spectacularly, but probably will survive, and other things we will learn a great deal from, and some will stick. And I, for one, am embracing and enjoying the freedom of being able to give some things a try that maybe break with tradition or are a new expression of the way things have always been. And I think that if we can take up some of that permission, we might find some really interesting things happen.
Thank you.
And I would, sorry.
No, please go on, Fran.
Oh, it was just really a personal point. My husband works as a pastor for children and young families in a congregation. And what I've noticed is actually much deeper pedagogy happening because of the online platform and the just different way of doing everything, and the way he's involved other children in it. So the platform has provided for ongoing and deeper learning involving more children. And that's just not my bias, it's other people responding.
Our next question from Anne. Anne, would you like to pose your question to the panel?
A friend mentioned earlier about the tiredness, being a person with young children. I think as leaders, we're feeling that, but I think also we need to remember that our parishioners are also in a similar boat. Many of them have children at home learning, and they're trying to work at the same time. Also, we have people with disabilities, people culturally diverse, people who've been newly diagnosed with long-term life-changing effects. Just wondering how people are sort of reaching out to these people. What constructive ways have they found helpful?
I'm happy to at least start an answer for that. One of the things we've started to do at the beginning of all of our parish meetings, which are all on Zoom, is just give people a chance to check in. And one meeting the other night, one young father was really struggling. He'd had a really tough day, and we just sort of put the meeting on hold while he talked about that and where he was at. And then the school principal and I followed up with him later the next day. So giving people, I suppose, the space to just tell us how it is, and then but doing the follow up later. That's been one of the things, I suppose, one of the skills we've learnt, not to just plough through a meeting straight, from go to woe, but to give people some space to, and the permission to download a bit. Because often they can't at home if their partner's working at home and the children are learning from home. This parish meeting might be the only time they get to speak to other people who are not work, who are not family, to be able to just download a bit.
I'd have two things to add to that. One of the first things that we did here was we trawled through the parish roll and extracted what we called the vulnerable list, which was basically anyone over 70, anyone who's dealing with illness, anyone with, or whatever would have made them a vulnerable person in a COVID world. And we have initially it was weekly, then subsequently we do a kind of fortnightly trawling through the list, and various members of the pastoral care team in the parish keep in regular contact with everyone on that list. The thing that doesn't pick up is the people who are not obviously vulnerable, but who become vulnerable. And that's been the hard bit of that particular exercise, working out how to add people onto that list. The second thing, though, is that all the Zoom stuff and the online church stuff and all the rest of it is absolutely fantastic, unless your work involves you being on Zoom or online constantly, 5-6 days a week for 6-7 hours. And God help you if you've got kids at home doing online learning. And the demographic that we've lost in online church is actually exactly that demographic. It's people with full-time professional jobs that they're now having to work entirely online, and people, our families ministry basically has half disintegrated because the kids are spending their entire time on Zoom for school, and the idea that you would go on Zoom to come to church is just like, no, we're going to the park. So that's been a really challenging thing. The 90-year-olds on Zoom, no problem, absolutely no problem. But a professional person in their 40s, no way.
The fact that, sorry, can I just add to that? Because the fact that our spaces are important and people value them and value being able to come. It's been really hard to say to people, I'm sorry, the chapel is closed. We're going to have to reschedule your wedding. And no, you cannot have the funeral that we promised your father, 12 months ago. We cannot have it in the chapel as you want because it's closed. And that it's just been tough. Disappointing people about expectations they had about key moments, and finding ways to do them differently, or for them just putting them off.
Thank you.
Our next question comes from Ian Palmer. Ian, would you like to speak to the panel?
Thank you very much. One of my good friends is in England, Andrew Greystone. And Andrew has been in the media technology, digital technology all his life. And writing recently, he says, unless the church embraces digital technology, it's going to be a bit like an analog television, quaint but useless into the future. He loves putting things in challenging way. And I was thinking, particularly, I wonder whether Fran could give some thoughts on this, about whether anyone in the Uniting Church has done any theological reflection on digital gathering as a way of celebrating Holy Communion.
Yes, they have. And I saw your question in the chat and went to the website of the Assembly and the VicTAS website, and I can't find the document, but you can be rest assured there was much conversation back in March. We just don't give directives in the way that other churches might. We just give the theological considerations for doing it this way or this way. But certainly there are quite a number of churches who would be celebrating communion on Zoom, but there are equally, and there are a slight few who will be doing it in a way that I think Craig described it, and then there'll be some who are waiting. And we have in our Reformed tradition ways of understanding that fasting time. But yes, there has been. I just can't find it right now. Did you want me to find it and send it to you somehow afterwards?
That would be very helpful. I mean, I think it could be a theological resource that could be useful to many people, not just to myself.
Yeah, it wasn't specifically about Zoom. It wasn't about which platform or not. It was more about whether we go ahead and celebrate or whether we wait.
I mean, the thing about Zoom is that you can gather people on the Zoom if it's a single time, as we gathered this afternoon.
And you're not sharing the one loaf, though. That's what they would say.
No, we're not. No. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next question is from Kate. Kate, would you like to speak?
Yes, thanks. I'm sorry you can't see me because my camera's died. But it was really just a follow-up from the comment that Craig made about making new disciples or new Christians evangelism. I was interested in hearing from the panel about ways in which they have found themselves making new Christians, or what's being encouraged in addition to encouraging people who already have the faith to grow in their faith. Thank you.
Stunned silence with evangelism.
I suspect the silence means that in lots of ways we find this very difficult right now. I will say that many people are having interesting conversations with people in their lives and have invited me at several points to become part of that conversation, that these moments of crisis are quite revelatory for many of us in terms of some of the underlying questions that we have about life and meaning and purpose, and that those conversations are certainly going on, and in some instances we're being invited into them. I will also say that as much as we've lost that ability for people to sneak into the back pew and sit there and suss things out, there is also a dynamic where participating somewhat anonymously in an online type event can be a very helpful first step to lots of people. Walking into a church is for many people, for a whole range of reasons, really confronting and not something that everyone would do. We've had huge participation in some of our smaller group events of people that have not darkened the door of a church for a very long time. And so if they're willing to show up, I think that that's quite fruitful. But the limitations of this moment are really significant when it comes to reaching people who are not part of our current conversation. And I think I would be being dishonest if I were to paint too rosy picture on how spectacularly we're going at engaging people beyond our regular community. I think it's a genuine challenge.
I think this is a really good moment for deepening discipleship. for a lot of people, and I think that's what I'm seeing happening for a number of our people. But it's our people who are already connected. That said, I've had a few conversations of people who have done exactly what Carolyn's been talking about of encountering things a little bit anonymously, and actually then taking the big step of sending an email to me to could we have a conversation about blah, blah, blah. There's been a couple of those. But it's been very interesting because in both the particular cases I'm thinking of, it's been a really good conversation over a cup of coffee when that was still a thing you could actually do in between things. But then it's been, I'll keep just kind of sitting right in the background now. And when you're doing things for real again, was actually one of the phrases someone used. When you're doing things for real again, I'll come and check out your church. But I thought that was a really interesting phrase, when you're doing it for real again.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Our next question is from Geralyn.
Thanks, Carly. And it was more a question directed to Tony. And I see you have made a bit of a response in the chat. But I guess as a Catholic, my experience is in recent months is that many of our Catholic parishes are only live streaming masses. And in some respects, I suppose I wondered about how much reflection our Catholic priests have given to opportunities to do, more than just use this time to include other forms of prayer that become a shared experience rather than this sense of the people of God, us as spectators. We touched on that earlier. I kind of worry that we've kind of, as a Catholic Church at least, we've tried very hard to shift a notion of church as the people of God. We've tried very hard, and in some respects we've kind of defaulted into a position in recent months where, in a sense, we've unwittingly emphasised or reinforced that the church is very much a clericalist sort of hierarchical approach. That's my sense of it anyway.
Yeah, there is a real danger if Mass is the only thing we're live streaming, that it just does become Father doing the magic on screen and people being reduced to passive spectators, whether they're in the church or whether they're at home. We've tried other forms of prayer and worship, particularly our first effort at that was during Holy Week. We used a lot of the resources that Liturgy Brisbane had put out. We had a modest uptake in that sort of stuff. And look, perhaps there's a number of reasons for that. It was really early on in the whole thing. People were still getting used to this, joining in online. We've tried a few things since then in terms of prayer and worship that have had, again, modest take up from the people. There's other sorts of parish activities that have gone on. Our scripture study's gone on. Our Lectio Divina has continued. So there have been those opportunities. But in terms of what we might call formal prayer, it's tended to be so far for us anyway, just Mass. And that's why, as soon as we can gather properly and, as Craig said, doing stuff for real, of course, that's what we want to get back to. As soon as the restrictions ease and we can have people coming back through the door, it'll correct that imbalance, hopefully.
And I think part of it there, Geralyn, is actually churches providing opportunities for lay people to self-start some stuff. So one of the things, there's a little group here that was really small, like about 4 of them, that used to meet to talk about movies, a little movie group. And I was asked early on in this, would it be all right if we moved our movie group onto a Zoom meeting? I said, yeah, it doesn't affect me one way or the other, go for it. And they're going gangbusters, and they're now meeting every week. They're watching a movie a week on SBS Live and talking it out, and usually something that's got something that's going to be vaguely religious to it, sometimes very vaguely. But it's, that's a completely self-starting group. That doesn't have to have a priest anywhere near it. And those are the sorts of opportunities, particularly for the community building end of stuff, which is some of the hardest things to replicate, that I think we need to be encouraging.
I'll just make a point too about Zoom, Frank.
Yeah.
Oh, just that, a few ministers I've been talking to have actually found that participation has increased. So the people are doing more of the work of the liturgy on Zoom than they are in person when they're in the building. So they're responding to prayers, they're participating in prayers. And the other thing ministers are saying is that they can see each other, and that one of the new things that may come out of this is that they rearrange the furniture permanently in their particular building because people want to see each other's faces now.
Mm-hmm.
Can I respond to that though, Fran? Because that actually makes, there are different dynamics there between small congregation as opposed to large congregation.
Yes, absolutely.
One of the challenges that we've had is that, you do something on Zoom and you've got a window, like at the moment I can see, 20 or 15 people, so, but if you've got a congregation that's normally like 150.
Impossible. Yeah.
Impossible. And that's been one of the real challenges in terms of how do you do stuff with large groups as opposed to
well, Uniting Church has mostly smaller groups.
Most of ours are too, don't worry.
I think another thing to add though is as we have been saying about learning the importance of being local and a building or a gathering. Another side to that is that I think many of those experiences where we identify only with our local bunch of people, something has happened to that too. And I'm sure, and many that I know that are engaged in online or Zoom or whatever kind of resourcing of the community find that there are people from other places, other towns. As Father Tony mentioned early on, you drew on resources from Brisbane. Similarly, I think people are actually discovering and participating in a wider sense of the church. And that has been one of the positive things, I think. Craig, you want?
I want to argue it's a negative. Because there are pluses and there are minuses, but we already, particularly in a big city like Melbourne, live in an environment where people can shop around and find my style of church. And one of the big dangers here is that people are interacting with church communities that make them feel comfortable rather than church communities that challenge them. And I've seen a little bit of that. There've been some real positives. We've had people from the US and the UK and all over Australia who've got some kind of past connection with Christchurch, and the community they've come back to at a time like this is Christchurch. That's lovely, but they're not connected with a worshipping community where they are, and that's sad for me.
Yes. Well, I absolutely agree that there are those difficulties, but for instance, I could give you chapter and verse of people from country towns where the kind of thing that you're able to do is not possible, and the kind of thing that we're able to offer is a resource for them that they're very grateful for.
Oh, absolutely. And the resource element is fine, but when it becomes, and I'm thinking of a couple of churches in Sydney that are really doing quite very, very slickly well produced production liturgies.
No names, no pack drill.
No names, no pack drill, but they might not be who you think. I'm thinking actually of places like Christchurch, St Lawrence and St James King Street. that are getting people from all over the world, you know, watching for the show.
Yes.
But they're not there.
That's tapping into a very real dynamic I'm seeing in ministers, which is a morale issue. If you happen to be placed somewhere that's very well resourced or got wonderful techie people who've just been waiting to do something like this, and then you can see, you know, everyone else doing brilliantly and comparing yourself all the time.
And you get to the thing of, oh, well, actually, we only need 2 or 3 churches for the whole of Melbourne.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
Frank, I'll hand over to you for some closing remarks.
Well, again, I want to thank you, Carly, for making all of this possible. We set out to ask ourselves some questions about the experience of being in lockdown, the challenge of COVID, to what it means for us to be the church. And we've reflected upon the being at least as much as the doing, the opportunities and the challenges, the tiredness and stress, but also the sense that there are profoundly significant things for us, that God is with us in this context. And I think that's the thing that is so helpful to us all, that across different traditions and different situations and environments, there is the invitation to know more of what it means to live in the presence of God, to engage with the challenges of life, and to know that we are not alone, but that God is with us, and we can indeed learn from this and grow through this experience. They are revelations, and this has been very positive. I want to thank our panelists. Our friend G has not been able to join us, but sent a message, and I've assured him of our prayers with him. And so to Colleen and Carolyn, to Tony, to Craig and Fran, and to all of you for being part of this conversation. Thank you very much indeed. And I affirm what Carly has said, that I hope this will be an ongoing conversation, and I look forward to being part of that with you. Thank you all.